it's time to sit back and relax with your favorite drink. And listen. Here there be monsters. In the late 1940s, only a few years after World War II had ended, the United States Army Air Forces embarked on a project that was as audacious as it was ridiculously dangerous. The project was known as Crusader, an experiment to test the feasibility of America's giant long-range bombers to be powered by nuclear propulsion. By the early 1950s, with the Cold War with Soviet Russia reaching a boiling point, the newly designated United States Air Force was ready to test the capability of having a nuclear-powered bomber fleet in the air 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with the capability to strike the Soviet Union within seconds of receiving the call that the world was coming to an end. Joining with the Atomic Energy Commission, the Air Force outfitted a specially modified Convair MB-36 bomber with an actual nuclear reactor. At the time, the MB-36 was one of the largest bombers ever designed, and dwarfed America's largest World War II bomber, the B-29 Superfortress. The MB-36 bomber completed nearly 90 hours of flight testing over the continental United States, with the nuclear reactor operating high over the skies of New Mexico and Texas. The operations were considered so risky that a second B-50 Superfortress, modified from the original World War II B-29 Superfortress, followed behind the MB-36 with a specially trained crew to handle radiological hazmat fallout should the MB-36 crash. By 1957, with initial flight testing completed, the MB-36 bomber, whose serial number was S/N 51-5712, was officially listed in the Air Force records as being scrapped, though continued research on the project continued until its cancellation in 1961. That's where the official US government records end, but where the account of following events begins. In 1958, under the thickest veil of secrecy, an MB-36 bomber with a number 51-5712, completely erased from its tail, landed on the island of Okinawa, about 900 miles southwest of Japan, to continue further flight and weapon delivery testing. Presumably, very few records remain of this phase of testing, as these were conducted at a level exceeding top secret, and any records which may survive to this day are still a closely guarded national secret. Still, by what secondary and tertiary accounts that do exist of that phase of testing, of which it can be safely assumed that half are inaccurate or completely false, the testing was considered a success by all measures, the nuclear-powered MB-36 having made successful secret test flights from the Philippine Sea to as far south as Australia and the northern tip of New Zealand and back. Rumours even circulated of a strange American bomber being seen over Chinese and North Korean airspace at the time. Sometime in early 1959, the MB-36, having completed that phase of testing, the bomber and its crew prepared for their flight back to the mainland United States. It was to be the longest flight for the nuclear-powered bomber, taking it from Okinawa over to the North Pacific Ocean to the Gulf of Alaska, south of Cook Inlet and Anchorage, and then across the entire United States mainland, until it reached Langley Air Force Base in Virginia. This was to be done entirely on nuclear propulsion and with absolutely no refueling stops. The accompanying B-50 Superfortress would be with the MB-36 over most of the Pacific leg until it was relieved by a second B-50 flying out of Anchorage. Accounts of what happened next, if indeed such accounts actually existed, are extremely scarce and border on wild speculation. Given what little accurate information is available, what can be reasonably surmised is this. About 3 hours into the flight, the accompanying B-50 Superfortress experienced some type of mechanical engine failure and was forced to return to Japan. However, for some unknown reason, the now unaccompanied MB-36 was ordered to continue on its mission to the rendezvous point with the second B-50 over the Gulf of Alaska. Who exactly gave this order is up for speculation, but the fact remained. The MB-36 would be alone for the next 5 hours until it linked up with their B-50 escorts. Sometime during that 5-hour window, the MB-36 bomber disappeared. No record of the US military search and recovery efforts exists, but it can be safely assumed that it was as extensive as it was secretive. The only indication that such a mission ever took place came from old Soviet naval reports, which were released in the early 1990s, during the period of glasnost, when the Soviet Union collapsed. The report came from a Soviet submarine which, at the time, was quietly stalking US naval surface vessels operating in the area. According to the report, several dozen US and Canadian naval warships were operating in a 1,500 square mile area of the Pacific Ocean in the waters west of British Columbia. According to the submarine captain, they seemed to be searching for something. For their part, both the United States and the Canadian government dismissed any such inquiries into this matter as simply a regularly scheduled joint naval exercise between two close NATO-allied nations. Still, the rumors persisted that angry messages were sent to the United States and the US Department of Defense from Canadian Prime Minister John Diefenbaker and the Canadian ambassador to the United States, Arnold Heaney, shortly after the search efforts ended. Apparently, they were extremely upset that the United States had somehow secretly and unnecessarily endangered the Canadian mainland in some way, and relations turned noticeably sour between the two neighboring countries for several months from 1959 to 1960. In 1961, newly elected American President John F. Kennedy officially scrapped the entire nuclear-powered bomber program, and the 15-year experiment became just another billion-dollar footnote in the annals of failed military experiments. The development of successful in-flight refueling for bombers and intercontinental ballistic missiles had made the nuclear-powered bomber project obsolete. The MB-36 Crusader project was swept under the rug and was very quickly forgotten. Oh, that should have been the end of the story, except for one seemingly unconnected event which occurred in 1968 in the waters of the Pacific Ocean. In March of that year, approximately 1,560 nautical miles north of the Hawaiian island of Oahu, the Soviet submarine K-129 was mysteriously lost with all 98 crew members on board. An extensive air search by the Soviet Navy found nothing of the stricken submarine, and rumors abounded as to what had caused it to sink, from a hydrogen explosion in the batteries to a leaking missile door causing one of her onboard missiles to explode, to even claiming that a United States naval submarine, the USS Swordfish, had intentionally rammed it and caused the Russian vessel to sink. Well, the Soviets stuck with the last theory that the United States was somehow responsible for sinking, and tensions again rose between the two superpowers, though the US Navy claimed that no such ramming had occurred. These tensions came to a head when only a couple of months later, in May of 1968, a US Navy skipjack-class submarine, the USS Scorpion, was mysteriously lost in the Atlantic Ocean, taking 99 American sailors with her. Several Soviet naval war vessels were operating in the area of the Scorpion's disappearance, and speculation was that the Scorpion was attacked by the Soviets in retaliation for the sinking of the Soviet K-129 submarine in March. This time, however, it was the Soviets who claimed to have had no involvement with the sinking. Regardless of who or what sank the USS Scorpion, tensions were at an all-time high between the Soviets and the United States, as the US was already deeply embroiled against a stubborn and determined communist enemy in Vietnam, while the communist Soviets were quickly spreading their influence all over Eastern Europe and threatening the Western European democracies. The safety switches on the nuclear weapon stockpiles of both sides had been shut off, and the threat of a nuclear conflagration was never more than a second away. Fortunately, a nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union never occurred during what is now considered the Cold War era, but other, seemingly completely disconnected occurrences began happening in the oceans across the entire globe. Fishermen, sailors, and those who made their trades by living off the ocean began reporting seeing strange anomalies in the water, things which were huge, unknown, and very much alive. Reports of sightings of giant sea creatures, reportedly resembling monstrous sea serpents or sea dragons in the Pacific Ocean, spiked by over 600% in the 1970s, including a famous picture which made the world news headlines of what was described as the carcass of a prehistoric plesiosaur dredged up from the ocean by the Japanese trawler Zuyumaru off the coast of New Zealand. While many in the scientific community speculated it was the remains of an unusually large basking shark, the carcass was thrown overboard by the crew after the captain took pictures of it. There was never any solid proof to either prove or disprove that it was either a known species of shark or, if it was, in fact, a recently deceased prehistoric dinosaur. These many hundreds of reports and sightings were never really taken seriously by the enlightened popular scientific community and were largely relegated to tabloid newspapers or brief, "What was that?" news reports on local television news. The popular narrative of the time was that anyone who believed those reports, or attempted to do any serious investigations into what were, in effect, ancient nautical horror stories told by drunken sailors, was not to be taken seriously. Such things were only an amusing distraction to the drudgery of daily life, and nothing more. This almost worldwide belief that there was no such thing as a Leviathan-sized creature lurking in the depths of the Pacific Ocean continued decades later, even when, in 1997, the U.S. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration recorded an odd, low-frequency, high-amplitude underwater sound in the South Pacific Ocean. Called simply the bloop, the sound was recorded at a point 50 degrees south and 100 degrees west of the southern tip of South America, and was picked up and heard by multiple sensors at a range exceeding 3,000 miles away. Though some in the scientific community initially stated that the bloop came from an as yet unidentified marine animal of exceedingly massive proportions, it took until 2012, over a decade and a half later, for scientists to dismiss the bloop as simply glacial ice moving. They came to this conclusion despite the fact that glacial ice has been moving for thousands of years and no prior recording of this magnitude had ever been recorded, and that the sound signature was a rapid variation in frequency, which can only be produced by marine animals. It was also near this area when crewmen aboard Japanese research vessels began reporting sightings of monstrous aquatic creatures, completely white in color, human-like in shape and over 90 to 100 feet in length, swimming off the waters of the Arctic not far from where the bloop sound was recorded at the tip of South America. One other fact which had been left out or simply forgotten from all of the news broadcasts was that the population of all species of marine whales in that part of the Pacific Ocean had fallen dramatically for over 2 decades, in spite of the fact that human whale harvesting had dwindled dramatically over the same time period. Other odd occurrences involving whales included the increased number of whale beachings along the shores of the Pacific Ocean. Environmentalists and activists attributed these mass suicides of whales upon the beaches surrounding the Pacific to sonar activity by U.S. naval submarines or climate change caused by U.S. military operations. Not one scientist or biologist ever brought up the theory that something predatory might have chased the whales to the shore, so eager was the desire to place blame on the United States military. In fact, the fear that U.S. military operations were causing global warming and forcing whales to beach themselves was so great that in 2010, Democratic Congressional Representative Hank Johnson of Georgia lectured the United States House Armed Services Committee and the American commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, Admiral Robert Willard, that continued U.S. military operations, such as a planned training operation to have Marines land on the beaches of Guam, would cause so much global warming, whale beaching, and overpopulation. The whole island of Guam will tip over and capsize. But whales weren't the only large creatures to suffer from mysterious deaths. Another incident occurred in the Pacific Ocean off the coast of Australia a few years later. Scientists had tagged a 9-foot-long female great white shark and was tracking it when, suddenly, the tag indicated that the temperature had abruptly increased to 78 degrees, and that the device had experienced a rapid plunge in depth to around 580 meters in a matter of seconds. The stunned scientists could only speculate as to the cause of such a bizarre event, and for days tried to come up with a logical explanation of what could do this to a great white shark. The only conclusion which the scientists could determine was that the 9-foot-long apex predator had been swallowed by something even bigger, which then immediately dived deeper into the depths of the ocean. To the world at large, all of these events, from the loss of the nuclear-powered MB-36 bomber back in 1959, to the loss of the Soviet submarine a decade later, to the increased sightings of weird, anomalous things in the Pacific Ocean, and to the deceased whale population and increased whale beachings over the last 30 years, were nothing more than peculiar, disjointed, and totally unconnected incidents. The world was rapidly becoming an overly complex place to live, with strife, civil war, economic and environmental turmoil, social unrest, drought, famine, disease, power-hungry politicians, and an endless array of other calamities that attacked the average everyday citizen of the planet Earth. They had no time to be concerned about mythical sea monsters or horrific Lovecraftian monstrosities from the depths, until the day that the wreckage of the MB-36 was discovered, washed ashore on a desolate island of the Pacific Ocean. Ironically, the wreckage of the long-forgotten MB-36 nuclear-powered bomber was hiding in plain sight for an undetermined number of years, as its mostly intact left wing and parts of the fuselage had washed ashore on a tiny, uninhabited island hundreds of miles south of Alaska. With modern surveillance, such as Google Earth and satellite mapping technology, it may even have been viewed hundreds of times by unsuspecting people who had little idea of the significance of their find, perhaps mistaking the wrecked warplane as just one of the thousands which had been lost in the Pacific during World War II. As there was no record of a nuclear-powered bomber being lost in the North Pacific, there was no reason to suspect that the wreckage was anything more than a tragic loss from a tragic war. Regardless, the wreckage remained undisturbed for decades, until a documentary news crew from the BBC hired an underwater research vessel to search for long-lost ships and planes which had perished during the horrific and deadly naval battles which had taken place between the United States and Imperial Japan's naval forces. They had just concluded filming and were sailing back to San Diego when, almost as an afterthought, the director of the documentary decided to make a detour to investigate the old wreckage which had washed ashore on that deserted island. It was not known if the vessel had ever reached its objective. 2 days after their last check-in with Pearl Harbor, all communications with the ship had been lost. An extensive search of the area by the British Royal Navy, the Canadian Navy, and the US Coast Guard commenced, though nothing was found of the missing research vessel, except various bits of floating debris and 2 empty life preservers which presumably had come from the ship. It was when the British Royal Navy decided to search the island where the British researchers were headed that the United States State Department did an incredibly odd thing. The US declared a 300-mile exclusion zone around the little 1.5 square mile island, forbidding any except authorized US naval warships to enter the restricted zone. It was almost 60 years to the day that the MB-36 went missing. The United States finally found pieces of that nuclear-powered bomber, and that, unfortunately, is the part of the story where I come in. My name is Captain Samuel Gabriel, United States Marine Corps. I'm the commander of a very highly trained and highly specialized unit of CBR&E, Seaburn Marines. Seaburn stands for chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear, and high-yield explosives. Our job as military emergency responders is to recognize and mitigate attacks from such weapons which could create mass casualties and mass disruption to society from, for example, a nuclear, chemical, or biological attack. Stationed in Hawaii, we were the nearest unit of this type to the mysterious little island that was located some 1,000 nautical miles due northwest of Oahu. Admittedly, calling on a Seaburn unit to search for a missing research vessel was highly unusual, but, as the old saying goes, ours is not to question why, ours is but to do or die. I was told to bring only the minimal amount of personnel that I'd need to conduct this search and recover operation. Still not knowing exactly what we were searching for, as my chain of command said, that was secret information and that I'd be filled in on a need-to-know basis. I chose 17 of my most experienced seaborne Marines and divided us into 2 teams of 9 Marines each. We were told to bring our heaviest hazmat suits, oxygen breathers, radiological sensors, radiation alarms, decontaminating agents, and a full combat load for our M4 rifles. In addition, all recording devices such as cell phones, GoPros, or any type of audio-visual recorder was strictly forbidden, all over what was supposed to be a simple search and recovery mission. Every one of us knew that there was some underhanded black ops thing going on when we boarded the naval assault ship, the USS Wasp, as it floated dockside at Pearl Harbor, waiting to take us on the 4-day journey to that small, lonely island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. For 2 days of that trip, my seaborne unit basically sat around aboard the massive USS Wasp assault ship, with its large internal bays which could comfortably hold an entire US Marine assault battalion, along with all its armored vehicles. For this mission, however, 2 ugly bus-shaped Boeing CH-46 Sea Knight helicopters, 2 AH-1Z Viper attack helicopters, and 2 UH-1Y Venom utility helicopters were parked aboard the ship's flat top. Again, these were not the types of aircraft which were optimized for air-to-sea searches. On the 3rd day of the voyage, when we were about 350 nautical miles from our destination, the captain of the USS Wasp had us do radiological surveys of the air and seas. To our astonishment, we found that both the air and sea samples east of the island contained an elevated amount of radiation. A second test at 300 nautical miles from the island revealed even higher levels of radiological contamination. The captain decided to change course to approach the island from a more southerly route, and to our relief, radiation levels dropped significantly. A hasty meeting inside the Tactical Operations Center of the USS Wasp was set to discuss possible causes and sources of the radiation. We had a significant amount of civilian specialists also on this mission, including 2 CIA agents straight from Langley, Virginia. They told us that the radiation was likely spillage from the Soviet K-129, which was lost decades ago, some 350 to 400 miles from our location. Well, this may well have been the case, but in a highly secretive mission, the US government had raised the wreckage of the K-129 from the sea floor, and by all accounts, there was very minimal radiation leakage from her missile silos. The next day, the USS Wasp took up station about 5 miles to the west of the target island. The radiation levels had increased steadily the closer we got to the island, but not to a point where the accumulation would be considered hazardous if we could complete the mission within 12 hours. Soaking inside our fully enclosed hazmat suits and straining from 50 pounds of gear and equipment under the humidity of the vast Pacific Ocean, my Marines loaded aboard one of the CH-46 Sea Knight helicopters destined for the shores of that mysterious island floating 5 miles in the distance. The fact that my Marines were also carrying fully loaded M4 rifles made me suspect that we were not going to be doing our primary mission as seaborne specialists, a feeling that was confirmed when I saw who was boarding the other CH-46 helicopter. The other Chinook helicopter was filled with specialists, also in hazmat suits, working for the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the U.S. Department of Energy, and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. They even had a team of US military historians aboard for good measure. Although our initial mission briefing aboard the USS Wasp was considered top secret, it was filled with only the barest of need-to-know data by the 2 high-ranking CIA types, followed by incessant reminders of the harsh penalties that we would expect if any word of this mission were leaked to the public. At that point, I had little idea of the impact that this discovery would unearth. In truth, I didn't believe the CIA types did either. My Marines and I were experts at our jobs when it came to securing hazardous, radioactive waste materials, even if they were long-dead bobbers lost in the ocean for decades. It was the CIA's job to cover up some past blunder that the US government was responsible for. We would do our jobs, they would do their jobs, and the world would be none the wiser. Flying in from the western part of the tiny island, the 2 CH-46 Sea Knights landed in a clearing on the beach. Though we knew it would be uncomfortable, the plan was to walk the 1 mile across the relatively flat island to where the wreckage of the plane lay washed up on the opposite beach. So far, there had been absolutely no attempt to ascertain the fate of the missing British research vessel, and it quickly became apparent that that was just an excuse to get us out on this humid, desolate island, enclosed in our heavy, claustrophobic-inducing hazmat suits. Breathing laboriously through our heavily filtered gas masks, we sweated under the merciless sun as we made our way deeper into the island. The 2 CIA types who were running the entire mission remained behind aboard the safety of the USS Wasp, but coordinated our movements via secured radio transmissions. Curiously, they told us Marines to leave all equipment behind inside the helicopters, except for our handheld radiologic sensors and our M4 rifles. The civilians would do all of the required work once we'd reached the wreckage. We could have scanned ahead using aerial drones, but again the CIA operatives were adamant that no visual recording devices were to be employed during this mission. We soon entered a jungle area where the trees seemed eerily weird and misshapen, as if their branches had been twisted to cause the trees to feel excruciating pain. There were no birds or animal life present, only these tortured and oppressed-looking trees. My Marines were taking the hike as well as could be expected, but the civilian specialists who were accompanying us were another story, unused as they were to the exertion that came with walking through a humid island jungle, sealed inside a heavy rubber and carbon suit which was lined with lead. 2 of the civilians, an obese, late middle-aged gentleman who was one of the military historians, and a young man who was one of the EPA specialists, were complaining of feeling dizzy and lightheaded, obvious symptoms of heat exhaustion. We sat them down as comfortably as we could on a fallen tree trunk underneath a jungle canopy and had them drink water through a tube connected to a bladder of cool water on their backs. I left one of my Marines to keep an eye on them, figuring that we wouldn't be gone for more than an hour, by which time I was hoping that the 2 civilians would be well enough to walk back to the Sea Knights. Why weren't we allowed to land the Sea Knights right next to the wreckage of the aircraft was never explained to me, but I figured that the CIA wanted eyes on the landscape, although we were forbidden to record it. I radioed the situation back to the ship, and the lead CIA operative impatiently ordered us to move out. We were now a quarter of a mile from the opposite beach, and in the thickest part of the jungle with a triple canopy of what looked like hideously misshapen palm and coconut trees masking the sky above us. We halted and stared in disbelief at what lay before us. There, half buried in the white sand and earth, were the skeletal remains of some type of aquatic creature which looked to be over 70 feet long when it was alive. It looked to be the remains of some type of whale, yet clearly it wasn't, as it had a neck that stretched across the ground and ended in a head which seemed far too big for the rest of its body. The gaping mouth hung open, revealing row upon row of dagger-like teeth, some measuring 6 inches long. It had what appeared to be 2 sets of massive flippers near the base of its neck, and the other set at the start of its long tail. At first I thought it may have been some species of prehistoric animal, except that the air was still filled with the fetid stench of decay and, amazingly, there was still some sun-bleached leathery tissue clinging to the undersides of the ribcage, meaning that, whatever this thing was, it had died fairly recently. What bothered me the most about the monstrosity was the condition of the bones and skeleton, as they seemed to be plagued with unnatural, cancerous growths along the entirety of its body, which seemed to twist the spine, neck, and tail into what looked to be uncomfortable angles. As massive as this dead thing was, it also looked to have lived a life of constant pain before death took it. Immediately I radioed our finding to the USS Wasp. After a few long minutes of what I took to be indecisive silence, the lead CIA operative acknowledged my transmission and ordered us to continue the mission. In a few minutes, we emerged from the sweltering jungle and walked onto the beach under the unforgiving sun. The large wreckage of a bomber's wing and about 30 feet of fuselage was sitting half buried on the beach. The radiation levels were already spiking as we approached, and it didn't take long for the second military historian, a young female, to confirm that this was indeed the wreckage of the MB-36, codenamed Crusader. At the time, none of us Marines were familiar with what she was referring to, so she gave us a very quick rundown on the history of the MB-36, which I'd previously written about earlier. Up until now, the existence of the crashed nuclear-powered bomber was just the stuff of forgotten myth and Cold War legend. But it was true. The EPA and the DOE personnel ran a battery of tests on the air, soil, and fuselage of the bomber, but we all already knew what had occurred. For over 6 decades, that radiological material had been contaminating an area of roughly 350 to perhaps as much as 500 square miles of the Pacific Ocean, mutating and corrupting the sea life around it. That nuclear reactor was here somewhere, buried under the tainted blue waves of the ocean, and giving birth to unimagined horrors. Once all the testing was completed, the civilian specialists retreated back into the jungle as I and my Marines rigged the wreck wing of fuselage of the bomber with explosives for detonation. We were halfway back to where we'd left the 2 heat-exhausted civilians when the explosives detonated. The jungle thudded like a heavy bass drum and echoed with the booming rumble as the MB-36 wreckage on the beach was reduced to nothing more than unrecognizable scrap. That was when we heard the high-pitched, hissing sound of a serpentine roar, followed by the sounds of M4 rifle fire coming in the distance. Ordering the civilians to stay put, my Marines and I ran in the direction of the firing, past where we'd first seen the skeletal remains of the mysterious dead beast. Before long, we were back where we'd left the 2 civilians suffering from heat exhaustion. What seemed to be a serpentine creature nearly 80 feet long, white in color and covered in what looked to be white, coarse fur, towered over them, its maw opened at least 10 feet wide and filled with scimitar-like teeth. The stench of rot and decay emanated from the thing as it dragged itself forwards on 2 large flippers. The 2 civilians were attempting weakly to crawl away as my Marines stood between them and the horrific thing which had slithered out of the jungle, firing their M4 into the creature's mouth. Without being told, my Marines charged the creature, clumsily running across the jungle floor in our bulky and uncomfortable hazmat suits, breathing hard and firing up at the serpent. The hideous thing looked down at us, seemingly confused by this new threat. We stood only 30 meters from the thing, towering a good 20 feet over us, emptying magazine after magazine of rounds into its head and neck. It swiped and bit at us, but failed to snatch any of us into its hungry maw. Finally, one of my Marines began lobbing rifle-launched high-explosive grenades at the hellish beast, and it collapsed injured to the ground. We collected my lone Marine as well as the 2 civilians that she was protecting, and policed up the rest of the civilians before making a dash back towards the way we'd come, while giving the wounded serpent creature a wide berth. At that point, the pilots of the CH-46s were sending out frantic transmissions telling us to hurry and return to the helicopters as something was happening with the USS Wasp. I radioed that we were a few minutes from breaking the cover of the jungle as we pushed, dragged, and carried the civilians forwards towards the beach. Behind us, we could hear branches snapping and saw trees falling as the white serpentine creature continued its pursuit of us. We finally broke the edge of the jungle and were greeted by the blinding sight of sunlight reflecting off the white sands. Although my Marines were completely exhausted from their ordeal, they still pushed the civilians towards the open ramp of the CH-46 and formed a very thin line that turned to face the approaching horror. Behind us, the trees parted as the thing pulled itself out of the jungle canopy and onto the beach, bloody mouth still opened and black, hostile eyes staring hungrily at us. Again we opened fire with our small arms weapons, while my grenadier launched a high explosive round that impacted inside the beast's maw. The creature's head exploded in a spray of fetid-smelling bone and gore, the massive 15-foot mandible tearing away from the rest of its head. Wearily, we turned and ran the rest of the way to our waiting CH-46 Sea Knight, the pilot eager to leave the beach. I stopped briefly to ensure that all of my Marines were accounted for, and looked out across the ocean toward the USS Wasp. Even at this distance, I could see the ocean churning and frothing behind our assault carrier, our 2 Viper and Venom gunship helicopters circling over the unnatural disturbance in the water. As our helicopters drew closer to our ship, the back ramps of the Sea Knight still lowered, we stared out the back in shock as the source of the churning waters behind the USS Wasp appeared. A mottled, brown-green neck, easily 80 feet long, stretched out of the ocean. An ovular body could be seen just under the thrashing waves that was roughly 40 feet long and tapered to a short, thick tail that ended in fins that resembled that of a shark. The Leviathan horror had 2 sets of gigantic flippers resembling those of a prehistoric plesiosaur, the front ones easily 20 to 30 feet long each. A dorsal fin protruded from between bony spines on its back that rose 30 feet above the waves as the horrific sea creature swam in an undulating motion to catch the USS Wasp. The most terrifying thing about the beast was its head, which seemed impossibly oversized to be supported by its neck. The head resembled that of a great white shark, with horny protrusions crowning its head and a jaw so massive that it could easily swallow a 9-foot-long great white shark whole. The thing was now only 100 meters behind the USS Wasp, which was steaming away from the creature at full speed and throwing up a massive wake behind her. All of a sudden, our AH-1Z Vipers opened fire with air-to-surface missiles and chain gun fire. The ocean erupted in large spouts of white waves as explosions stitched the back of the creature. The mutated monstrosity hissed loudly, turning its ungodly large head towards the sky. By this time, the 2 UH-1Y Venom helicopters were also adding their ordnance to the cacophony of heavy weapon fire, raining machine gun and rocket rounds down upon the creature. Even my Marines were firing out of the open back ramp of our CH-46, using their personal small arms weapons. Hemorrhaging blood, gore, and chunks of flesh, the creature turned away from its pursuit of the USS Wasp, turning left just split seconds before it would collide with the ship. One of its gigantic flippers hit the assault carrier on its port side as the creature dove under the waves and actually tipped the USS Wasps towards starboard. Our assault carrier rocked back and forth for a few tense moments before regaining stability, and we were allowed to land aboard her deck shortly after. The USS Wasp was already steaming back towards Pearl Harbor when our 2 CH-46 Chinook helicopters finally touched down on her deck. The 2 CIA operatives apparently having seen enough and deciding that discretion was the better part of being a meal to some radiation-mutated undersea nightmare. After a week of extensive debriefings at Pearl, my unit was suddenly disbanded, my Marines placed on leave and awaiting orders for further reassignment to other units. I was placed on leave and am now awaiting a transfer to a unit currently operating in Africa. Meanwhile, the US Navy is currently conducting extensive naval operations within a 1,000-mile radius of the island. Officially, the unscheduled exercise is to perform anti-submarine and search and rescue training. The reports abound that a large naval salvaging and scavenger ship outfitted with radiological protective measures was seen leaving Naval Station Pearl Harbor in the wee hours of the morning prior to the Navy exercise. As I write this, I'm sitting out on the back porch of my ranch home in Ogden, Utah. I've recently bought this land and I purposely built my house on hilly land far from the nearest big city and a mile from my nearest neighbors. It's nighttime and the stars twinkling above the cold, clear skies are shining brightly. I stare up at them, wondering what ancient mysteries they hold. Do they wait for the primitive species from Earth, so recently divorced from our homes within the caves, to clumsily fly out to them? I laugh unconsciously at something my 7-year-old son, Sammy Gabriel Jr., said tonight before he went to bed. He said that when he grows up, he wants to join the new US military space force, so that one day he could explore the galaxy, find new alien species, and shoot them. That's fine, I guess, as long as he doesn't join the Navy or the Coast Guard or any trade that puts him out into the middle of the ocean. I've seen what lurks under the waves, and there be monsters there. So another fantastic story there from Taxi Dancer, really hitting out of the park again. So, what did I do a while back? Oh yeah, from the halls of Montezuma to the depths of outer space. 3-hour epic, and a lot of you quite enjoyed that one. Well, there are 2 further episodes, and they're both enormous as well. And I do plan to read them at some point, but you're just going to have to bear with me because they are enormous and, well, it takes quite a while to put them together. But they are coming, okay? Well, that's it for me for one evening, but I'll be back again very soon. Now, a lot of you are still going through pretty tough times because of the virus and everything. And all I can really say is I'm here thinking about you. You take care out there, yeah? Well, best I can do is to keep you entertained. So, till next time, very, very sweet dreams, and bye-bye. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story today. It really means a lot to me and to the author of the story, of course. Well, if you want to know more about me, I'm pretty much everywhere on social media. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can download my music on SoundCloud. I've got a Patreon if you feel like. Throw me $1 or $2. Very much appreciated. And of course, on Reddit, I have a place where you can leave stories if you want me to read one that you've written. Well, hoping to see you all again very soon. Till then, sweet dreams, and bye-bye.